Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Space Channel. Tonight, an unsettling question that the title of this video can only ask in passing. Can the species ever truly leave the small world it was born on? Not in the everyday sense of an orbit or a brief crossing to a neighboring planet, but in the deeper sense, the leaving that crosses the gaps between stars, the leaving that breaks the gravitational hold of the home sun forever. The honest answer turns out to be neither yes nor no, but a sobering catalogue of limits, each with its own character. Some are absolute and final, set into the geometry of the universe itself. Some are merely difficult, the kind that a wealthier or more patient civilization could climb past. Some are not limits at all, only the present condition of a species that has barely begun to walk outward. Over the next 2 hours, each limit is laid down one at a time, calmly, with its numbers and mechanisms intact. If you find these explorations worth your time, a like or a subscribe helps the channel reach others who do. Thank you for being here. But for the next 2 hours, none of this is something you need to carry. Settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow. Let the day fade away. Let's begin. Part 1. The rocket equation and the first quiet limit. There is a particular question that returns each time a body looks up at the night sky and notices how the stars are pinned in place over a small, quiet field. The question is whether any of it is reachable. Whether the lights overhead are addresses or only pictures. Whether a body or the descendants of a body could ever stand under a different sun and call it the same word. The question is older than the species. It has been answered again and again by different civilizations, in different ways, in different centuries, and each time the answer has been a little softer than the one before. Tonight the answer is laid down one piece at a time, in the slow voice of a documentary that is in no hurry to arrive at its own conclusion. The deepest limit on how far a body can travel is not the speed of light. It is not biology. It is not money. It is arithmetic. The arithmetic was written down at the end of the 19th century by a quiet schoolteacher who spent his life in a wooden house in a small Russian town and who calculated the limit in the margins of his other work. The relationship he found has not been improved on since. A rocket's final speed is set by the speed of its exhaust, multiplied by the natural logarithm of the ratio of its starting mass to its empty mass. The equation is small, almost domestic, and it carries the whole engineering history of leaving a planet inside its 3 terms. The exhaust speed is the speed at which a rocket throws mass out behind it. The mass ratio is the ratio of how much the rocket weighs full of fuel to how much it weighs empty. And the natural logarithm is a quiet, slow-growing function that turns very large mass ratios into only modestly larger final speeds. That logarithm is the cage. Doubling the final speed of a ship does not double the fuel required to reach that speed. It squares it. Tripling the final speed cubes it. To go 3 times faster, a rocket carries roughly 20 times the propellant. To go 10 times faster, more than 20,000. Most of the rocket becomes the propellant for the propellant for the propellant. Fuel that is mostly there to lift other fuel. A staircase that grows steeper with every step taken. The merit figure of a propulsion system is its exhaust velocity, sometimes expressed instead as specific impulse, the number of seconds during which a unit of propellant could lift its own weight under the gravity of Earth. The specific impulse is a kind of compactness rating for fuel. The higher the specific impulse, the more push per gram of propellant. Chemical rockets, the only kind that has ever been used to leave the planet at scale, sit between about 300 and 450 seconds of specific impulse with exhaust velocities of roughly 3 to 4.5 kilometers per second. Hydrogen and oxygen, burned together in the lightest possible mixture, sit near the ceiling for chemistry. No chemical reaction yields more energy per unit mass than hydrogen and oxygen recombining into water. The result is a quiet ceiling on what chemistry can do, set by the chemistry itself. Above chemistry sits a slow ladder of alternatives. Ion engines, which accelerate a stream of charged particles using electric fields, reach exhaust velocities of about 20 to 50 kilometers per second, 10 times better than chemistry. Their thrust, however, is small. The push of an ion engine on its ship is comparable to the weight of a sheet of paper. They can run for years without exhausting their reservoir, and the ships they drive accelerate slowly, but they accelerate steadily, and over months the small thrust accumulates into significant velocity changes. Several missions across the solar system have used ion drives to good effect in this way. Above ion engines sit nuclear thermal concepts. A nuclear reactor heats a working fluid, typically hydrogen, and pushes it out the nozzle at higher exhaust velocity than chemistry alone could provide. The figures are roughly 9 kilometers per second, about twice the best chemistry. No full flight system has flown, though prototypes were tested on the ground in the middle of the last century, and the architecture has been revisited periodically since. Above nuclear thermal sit nuclear electric concepts, in which a reactor powers an electric drive, reaching exhaust velocities in the high tens of kilometers per second. And above those sit fusion concepts, in which the rocket carries deuterium and tritium and ignites them, with exhaust velocities measured in thousands of kilometers per second, perhaps 1% of the speed of light. Fusion propulsion has been studied for more than half a century. No working fusion drive has flown. At the very top of the propellant ladder sits antimatter. The theoretical exhaust velocity of an antimatter drive approaches the speed of light itself. The mass energy obtainable from 1 kilogram of antimatter combined with 1 kilogram of normal matter is the maximum any chemistry or any nuclear process could ever match, set by mass energy equivalence. The total amount of antimatter that has ever been produced on Earth across all of human history weighs a few nanograms. The energy cost to produce it dwarfs the energy stored in it by many orders of magnitude. Antimatter is, for now, the ceiling visible from a distance but not yet reached. Even with the best chemistry ever built, reaching low Earth orbit requires a rocket whose initial mass is more than 90% propellant. The Saturn V, the largest vehicle ever flown to the Moon and back, was about 93% propellant by mass at liftoff. The rest was structure, payload, engines, and the small payload of human beings being lifted. Reaching the surface of the Moon and returning to Earth required a launch stack many times larger than the small capsule that came home. Reaching the surface of Mars and returning is at the edge of what chemistry can support, without staged miracles or in-orbit refueling. Reaching the nearest star with chemical propulsion is not a question of expense. It is a question of physical impossibility. The mass ratio required would exceed the mass of the entire observable universe by an unimaginable margin. There is not enough chemistry in existence to do it. This is the first quiet limit. It is set by chemistry itself, by the energy stored in molecular bonds, by the speed at which a chemical reaction can throw mass out the back of a nozzle. The limit is not raised by better engineering. It is raised only by changing the energy source. Each step up the propulsion ladder is a step into a new family of energy, with new handling requirements, new safety considerations, new political and social weight, and new physical phenomena to manage. Each step shifts the binding constraint without removing it. The cage is not opened. The cage is enlarged. It is worth pausing here, in the slow voice of this documentary, to notice what the first limit teaches. It teaches that distance is bought with mass, that mass is bought with energy, and that energy density per unit of mass is a finite quantity that has a ceiling somewhere out near antimatter. Above that ceiling, no engine can be built. The engineering effort to climb the ladder is real, and at every rung there is a long and patient body of work being done. But the ladder itself is finite. There are a small number of rungs between chemistry and the highest theoretical drive, and the universe will not provide more. The schoolteacher who wrote the rocket equation did not live to see a rocket fly. He died in the second decade of the 20th century, more than 30 years before the first liquid-fueled vehicle reached space. He published his equation in a small Russian journal that no one in the West read for many years. He sketched plans for ships that did not exist, drew diagrams of orbital mechanics that would not be observed for decades, and conceived of the cosmonaut centuries before anyone used the word. He understood the cage before there was a ship to be inside it. He left behind a piece of arithmetic that is still the floor of the field, and every engineer who has ever built a rocket has worked inside it. It is a quiet inheritance. It does not announce itself. It is simply there, in the background, every time a vehicle leaves the surface of a planet. There is a particular intuition the arithmetic delivers, slowly, to anyone who works with it for a long time. It is the intuition that the universe charges for distance in the currency of mass, and that the price grows steeply when the desired distance grows past the corner of the local neighborhood. Within the gravitational well of a single planet, the price is high but payable. Within the gravitational well of a single star, the price grows sharply but is still within the resources of a wealthy civilization. Past the edge of a single solar system, the price is no longer payable in the chemical currency the species currently uses. The currency must change. The chemistry must give way to the nuclear to the fusion to the antimatter to the beamed energy concepts that leave the fuel on the ground. Each step in this progression is a different conversation with the universe about what the species is willing to spend. A further property of the arithmetic deserves a quiet mention. The logarithm in the rocket equation is generous in one specific way. Modest improvements in exhaust velocity translate into substantial improvements in achievable mass ratio. Doubling the exhaust velocity is not a small thing. It moves the practical envelope of a propulsion system in ways that look small on paper but feel large in practice. The history of rocketry is, in part, the history of slow climbs up the exhaust velocity scale, with each gain producing more capability than the bare numbers would suggest. This is one of the small mercies of the equation. It is also one of the reasons that the field continues to invest in incremental propulsion improvement, because each rung climbed buys more than its apparent height. Part 2. The energy budget. If chemistry is the cage, then energy density per unit mass of fuel is the key to the lock. Each step up the propulsion ladder is a step up in energy density per kilogram of propellant. And each step costs more to build, more to handle, more to keep contained, more to license, and more to insure. The ladder is short. It runs from chemistry at the bottom to antimatter at the top, with 3 or 4 real rungs between them. Above the top rung, there is no further ladder, because there is no further energy. The maximum energy obtainable from a kilogram of matter is set by mass energy equivalence itself, and antimatter sits at that ceiling. It is worth pausing here to walk the rungs in plain numbers, with all the figures spelled out in the unhurried way a documentary does, so the listener can feel the spacing of the steps. Chemical propellants store about 10 million joules per kilogram, give or take. Gasoline, kerosene, hydrogen, and oxygen, the chemical fuels of the rocket age, sit in this range. They are the rung the species currently stands on and have stood on for the 70 years of the space age. Above chemistry, nuclear fission of uranium-2, 3, 5 yields about 80 trillion joules per kilogram of fuel. That is 8 million times more than chemistry per unit mass. A small nuclear core can deliver the energy output of an enormous chemical reservoir. The difference is the difference between a furnace and a star. Above fission, the fusion of deuterium and tritium yields about 340 trillion joules per kilogram of fuel. Roughly 4 times better than fission, and the same arithmetic that powers the cores of stars. Fusion has been demonstrated in the laboratory and in weapons, but a fusion reactor that produces more energy than it consumes, sustainably, across long durations, has not yet been built. Decades of work have brought the field closer, with recent net energy positive ignition experiments crossing important thresholds. But the engineering of a fusion power plant, let alone a fusion drive, remains an open project. Above fusion sits matter-antimatter annihilation, about 90 quadrillion joules per kilogram of antimatter, combined with an equal mass of normal matter. 500 times better than fusion per unit mass. The theoretical maximum, set by the equation that relates mass and energy. No higher rung exists. The cage above this point is the cage of the universe itself. Beneath these numbers sits a quiet observation. The total amount of antimatter that has ever been produced on Earth, across the half-century of accelerator physics, weighs only a few nanograms. The energy cost to produce that antimatter is many orders of magnitude greater than the energy stored inside it. To produce 1 gram of antimatter at present accelerator efficiencies would cost more than the annual electricity output of a small nation. To produce a kilogram, the budget of a continent. To produce the tons needed to fuel a serious interstellar drive, more than the present global economy can deliver. The ceiling is visible. The path to the ceiling is not yet walked. A second energy limit applies not to the propellant carried, but to the energy required to accelerate the ship. This is a separate ceiling, and it bites harder than the first as the desired speed grows. To accelerate a 1,000-ton crude vessel to 10% of the speed of light costs roughly the entire annual electricity output of human civilization, even at perfect efficiency. To accelerate the same ship to half the speed of light costs roughly 25 times more, because kinetic energy grows with the square of velocity. To accelerate it to 9/10 of the speed of light costs roughly 100 times more again, because relativistic kinetic energy diverges as the speed approaches light. The numbers become unbounded as the velocity approaches the ceiling. Beamed energy concepts attempt to escape this ceiling by leaving the energy source on the ground. A laser array on a planet sends light to a sail on the ship. The ship carries no fuel for acceleration. The sail intercepts the light pushes the sail, and the ship gains velocity without burning anything on board. This is the family of architectures that includes light sail concepts proposed for tiny gram-scale probes. The arithmetic is favorable for such microprobes. A small laser array, of the kind a continent could build, can push a probe weighing a single gram to a significant fraction of the speed of light within a few minutes. For larger ships, the arithmetic becomes punishing again, because the energy delivered to the sail must scale with the mass of the ship and the desired final velocity, and the laser array must scale to match. Crewed vessels driven by beamed energy remain a possibility for the deep future. They are not yet within reach. Inside these numbers lives a strange and quiet feature of relativistic energy. As an object approaches the speed of light, the energy required to add the next kilometer per second of velocity grows toward infinity. The cost of velocity is not a flat tax. It is a curve that bends upward sharply as the speed approaches its ceiling. At half the speed of light, the cost of the next small increment of velocity is roughly 15% higher than the naive prediction. At 9/10 the speed of light, the cost is more than double the naive prediction. At 99% the speed of light, the cost is roughly 7 times the naive prediction. At 99.9%, more than 20 times. At 99.99, more than 70. The ship that wants to be a heartbeat faster than the one that came before it must pay disproportionately more energy for that heartbeat. This is one of the universe's quiet generosities, looked at from inside the ship. The same factor that makes the next increment of velocity expensive from outside also compresses the apparent journey from inside. A crew approaching the destination at very high velocity sees the distance to the destination shrink in their own frame. The faster the ship goes, the shorter the journey appears to its own crew, even as it grows arbitrarily expensive in energy to extract the next moment of speed. The trade is not a fair one in either direction, but it is a real one. The universe does not refuse the request. It only sets the price. Sitting under all of this is a softer observation. The total energy budget of human civilization at the present moment is around 500 to 600 exajoules per year, across all forms of energy use, fossil and electrical, and biological and otherwise. To accelerate a crude ship of meaningful size to a meaningful fraction of light speed requires a substantial fraction of that annual budget, sustained for a substantial fraction of a year at perfect efficiency, with no losses. No civilization on Earth is currently in a position to do this. The energy cost is not, however, infinite. It is large, but finite. It scales with the size of the civilization and with the maturity of its energy infrastructure. A civilization with energy production an order of magnitude greater than the present one could build such a ship without straining itself. A civilization with energy production 2 orders of magnitude greater could send many. The limit is not a wall. It is a slope. There is a quiet patience inside the energy budget. Each generation of humans on Earth has had access to more total energy than the generation before it. The species has climbed a long slope of energy availability across the past few centuries and shows no sign of stopping. Whether the climb continues, and at what rate, is a question of the future, not of physics. But the underlying physics permits the continuation. The ceiling is the speed of light, and the slope between the present generation and the ceiling is open. It is worth pausing to consider the implications of the slope and of what it would mean to climb significant portions of it. A civilization with energy production, an order of magnitude greater than the present one, could build, sustain, and fly a serious, crude, interplanetary infrastructure. A civilization 2 orders of magnitude beyond the present could send small ships to nearby stars. A civilization 3 orders of magnitude beyond the present could send large ships to nearby stars. A civilization 4 orders of magnitude beyond the present, the scale sometimes contemplated for a fully solar system spanning industrial economy, could in principle attempt the architectures studied by interstellar planners, fusion engines, antimatter caches, beamed energy infrastructures so large they take up the surface of a small planet. The climb is steep, but not unbounded. Each rung opens a new neighborhood of capability. There is a further quiet observation. The energy budget for accelerating a ship is also the energy budget for decelerating it on arrival. A ship at half the speed of light must shed all of that kinetic energy before it can rendezvous with the destination star. The deceleration is, by symmetry, just as expensive as the acceleration. If the ship cannot decelerate, it merely passes through the destination system at high speed, gathering a few minutes of data and continuing onward into the dark. For any rendezvous mission, the energy cost is essentially doubled. For any return mission, doubled again. This is why some interstellar concepts focus on one-way flybys or on small probes that can decelerate against the destination star's own magnetic field using a magnetic sail. The arithmetic of deceleration is part of the energy budget, and it is often more binding than the arithmetic of acceleration alone. Part 3. The body inside the ship. There is a third limit, softer and harder to see than the first two, and it has nothing to do with engines or fuel. It is the body. The human animal evolved at the bottom of a gravity well, under a magnetic shield, in a stable temperature range, with a regular day-night cycle, in the company of trillions of microbes, eating fresh proteins and unprocessed plants, drinking liquid water, breathing an atmosphere with a particular mix of nitrogen and oxygen and trace gases. Every one of those conditions disappears the moment the ship leaves the magnetosphere. The body keeps the conditions of its evolution by default, and it suffers, in measurable and patient ways, when those conditions are withdrawn. Microgravity is the first and most studied of the body's limits. The bones of a vertebrate animal are built for the load they carry against the pull of a planet. Remove the load, and the body begins to discard the calcium and phosphorus that make the bones strong, because the body has, on a tight timescale, no further use for the strength. In the laboratory, and in the small population of long-duration crew members who have spent 6 months or more on orbital stations, bone density falls by roughly 1% per month from the weight-bearing bones of the hips, the spine, and the legs. The effect is reversible on return to gravity, but the recovery is slow. The bones do not return to their pre-flight density for many months after landing, and some studies suggest that the recovery may never be complete in older crew members. Muscle mass falls alongside bone. Skeletal muscle, particularly the postural muscles that hold a body upright against gravity, can lose 20% of its strength in 2 weeks if entirely unweighted. Exercise countermeasures slow, but do not stop the process. Crew members on long-duration stations spend 2 hours or more each day on resistance machines, treadmills with bungee restraints, and stationary cycles, and they still return to gravity with measurable muscle loss. The countermeasures are imperfect because the load on the muscle is imperfect. A treadmill held down by elastic cords is not the same load as a body walking under its own weight on a planetary surface. Body fluids redistribute upward in microgravity. The cardiovascular system, evolved to push blood up against gravity, suddenly has no gravity to push against, and the pressure in the upper body rises. Crew faces become rounder. The veins of the forehead and neck become more prominent. Pressure rises behind the eyes, producing a syndrome that has flattened the eyeballs of long-duration crew members and shifted their vision toward farsightedness for the duration of the flight and for months afterward. The optic disc swells. The choroid thickens. The retina shifts. None of these effects has been catastrophic in the small population studied so far, but none has been reversed entirely either, and the consequences for crews flying for years rather than months are not yet known. The cardiovascular system itself remodels to a new equilibrium. The heart, no longer required to push blood against gravity, becomes more spherical and somewhat smaller. Resting heart rate drops. Returning to gravity becomes a sustained challenge for weeks. Crew members landing after long flights have difficulty standing without fainting. The vestibular system, which interprets head motion through fluid shifts in the inner ear, becomes confused. Crew members on landing day cannot reliably walk in a straight line for the first hours back on the ground. Immune function shifts in microgravity in ways that are still being mapped. Latent viruses, particularly the herpes family, reactivate at higher rates in crew members in flight. Microbial communities in the gut and on the skin restructure. Some of these effects are subtle. Others are concerning for crews far from medical support. A bacterial infection that would be unremarkable on Earth could become serious months away from a doctor on a ship with limited supplies. Beyond microgravity sits radiation, and radiation is the second large biological burden of any crossing. Earth's magnetic field deflects most of the steady solar wind and many of the heavier charged particles flung outward by solar flares. The atmosphere absorbs the rest. The moment a ship passes the magnetosphere, the crew is exposed to two distinct radiation populations, each with its own character and its own danger. The first population is the galactic cosmic ray flux. These are high-energy charged particles from outside the solar system, mostly protons but also heavier nuclei, up to iron and beyond. They are present continuously, in every direction, and they are difficult to shield against because their energy is so high. A galactic cosmic ray striking a thin wall produces a shower of secondary particles, some of which are more damaging than the original. Thicker shielding reduces the primary flux, but increases the secondary shower. The compromise is delicate. Water and polyethylene help moderate the flux. Thick rock or regolith, of the kind that could be packed around a habitat on the surface of Mars or the Moon, helps more. Active shielding using artificial magnetic fields is studied, but not yet engineered, into a flight system. A crew on a multi-year crossing accumulates a cosmic ray dose that approaches and may exceed the lifetime limits established for radiation workers on Earth. The second radiation population is the solar energetic particle event. These are bursts from solar flares, episodic but capable of delivering a fatal dose in hours during the worst storms. The largest historical solar storms, if they recurred during a crewed crossing of interplanetary space, could kill an unshielded crew within days. A storm shelter, heavily shielded with water or stored consumables, is part of every credible mission architecture beyond low Earth orbit. The crew retreats to the shelter when a storm warning arrives. The lead time is short, sometimes only minutes, and the dependence on real-time solar monitoring is total. A long crossing requires a closed life support loop. Air, water, food, and waste must cycle through the cabin indefinitely without resupply. Current closed-loop systems on space stations recover most of their water and a smaller fraction of their oxygen, but still rely on regular ground deliveries of food and consumables. A true closed loop, able to feed a crew for years without resupply, has never been flown. Experimental habitats on Earth have tested closed-loop concepts for months at a time with mixed results. The biological complexity of a closed ecosystem is large. Microbial communities drift. Plants fail to set seed. Atmospheric trace gases accumulate or deplete in ways that affect the health of the people inside the loop. The engineering of a closed ecological life support system is a separate science from rocket engineering, and it has its own slow, patient body of work. Then there are the timescales. Even at 10% of the speed of light, the journey to the nearest star takes more than 40 years one way. At 1% of light, more than 400. Without a fundamental new propulsion architecture, any human crossing of an interstellar gap is a multi-generational undertaking. the ship becomes a small civilization with its own demographics, its own culture, its own politics, its own diseases, its own religions, its own quarrels. A generation ship requires a minimum viable population large enough to maintain genetic diversity across many generations. Modern estimates suggest several hundred breeding individuals as a working number, though the exact figure is contested. It also requires a stable governing structure, a stable educational system to preserve technical knowledge across centuries, a stable economic system, and a stable culture able to keep meaning alive in people who will never see the destination. There are softer biological mitigations to consider. Hibernation, in which the body is held at a low metabolic rate for long durations, is studied in animal models and in early human trials, but no human has been hibernated for more than a few days. Embryo storage, in which the genetic material of a future population is carried frozen and the colonists are born at the destination, sidesteps some of the generation ship problems but introduces new ones. Who raises the children? Who teaches them? What culture do they inherit? Genetic modification to better tolerate radiation and microgravity is a research direction with deep ethical complications and no current flight applications. Pharmaceutical countermeasures for bone loss, muscle loss, and cardiovascular remodeling are an active area of work and have already produced clinically useful drugs for terrestrial applications. The body is the third limit. It is not built for the trip. Mitigations exist for some of its symptoms. None of them solves the whole burden. For some destinations, the limit on what a body can endure is more binding than the limit on what an engine can deliver. The engineer and the physician work the same problem from opposite ends. There is one more biological consideration that belongs in this section, because it touches on every long mission and on every architecture for permanent off-world presence. It is the question of growing up under different gravity. The species evolved at one specific gravitational acceleration. Bones, muscles, the cardiovascular system, the inner ear, the development of the fetal skeleton, the calibration of motor control in early childhood, all of these are tuned to a particular gravitational background. A child born and raised under a different gravity, whether the lower gravity of the Moon or Mars, or the variable artificial gravity of a rotating habitat, may develop a body that is healthy in that environment, but cannot tolerate the gravity of Earth. The question is largely unstudied because no human has yet been born off Earth, and only a handful of mammals have been born in low Earth orbit during brief experiments. The implications are deeper than they first appear. A permanent human presence on Mars, for example, may produce, within a few generations, populations that cannot return to Earth without serious medical risk. The species would, in a quiet way, begin to fork. The fork is not necessarily a tragedy. It may be the natural outcome of any sustained off-world settlement. But it is a feature of the biology that any long-duration program must take seriously. The Mars-born or Moon-born child is not a smaller Earth-born child. The child is a different version of the species, adapted to a different gravity. The biological limits of space travel are not only the limits on the present body, they are the limits on the descendants of the present body, raised in conditions the species has never before encountered. Part 4. The speed of light. The fourth limit is the only one that does not bend. The speed of light is not a posted limit on a road that could be raised by a wealthier civilization. It is not an engineering challenge waiting for a clever solution. It is built into the geometry of the universe, into the way distances and times relate, into the way cause and effect are sewn together. The interval between events in space-time is defined in such a way that no signal, no body, and no information can travel faster than light through space and the equations of motion forbid any mass-bearing object from reaching exactly light speed. Everything that has mass is bound by this fence. Everything that has ever existed has been on the slow side of it. The number itself is just under 300,000 kilometers per second, or about 186,000 miles per second. In a vacuum, this speed is the same for every observer in every frame of reference. It does not matter how fast the observer is moving. A photon that passes a stationary observer at the speed of light also passes a fast-moving observer at the speed of light. The arithmetic that should produce different results by everyday intuition does not. The speed of light is a universal constant, and the consequences of this fact are far stranger than the fact itself. As a body approaches the speed of light, its kinetic energy diverges. To carry a body to half the speed of light costs roughly 15% more energy than the naive prediction. To carry it to 9/10 costs more than double. To carry it to 99% costs roughly 7 times the naive prediction. To carry it to 99.9, more than 20 times. The closer the speed approaches light, the more energy is required to extract each additional kilometer per second, and, at the limit, an infinite amount. There is no engine, no chemistry, no nuclear arrangement, no antimatter store, no beamed energy array, no architecture of any kind, real or theoretical, that can deliver infinite energy to a finite mass. The fence holds. From the perspective of the ship, however, the journey is shorter than the outside would suggest. The same factor that makes the next increment of velocity expensive from outside compresses the apparent journey from inside. The crew, traveling at half the speed of light, experiences time running about 15% slower than the outside. The crew traveling at 90% experiences time running about half as fast. At 99%, about 1/7. At 99.9%, about 1/22. At 99.99, about 1/70. The destination star moves closer in the ship's frame by exactly the same factor. A trip that takes 40 years from the perspective of Earth, at 99% of the speed of light, takes about 6 years from the perspective of the crew. A trip that takes 400 years from the perspective of Earth, at the same velocity, takes about 60 years from the perspective of the crew. This is sometimes described as the universe being generous about how far a body can travel within a single biological lifetime. From inside the ship, the journey shortens. From outside, the journey takes the full external time. Both perspectives are correct. They are not contradictions but two true descriptions of one event, written in different frames of reference. The geometry of space-time makes them consistent. The same event can take 6 years to one observer and 40 to another, and both are right. The trade is asymmetric in a deeper way. The crew who travel at high velocity and return to their home planet find that more time has passed at home than has passed on the ship. The friends and family they left behind are older than they are. The civilization they returned to has moved on. The arithmetic produces a kind of one-way travel into the future, available to any ship that can reach a meaningful fraction of light speed. A crew that leaves at 20 and returns at 25, traveling at 99% of light speed for the round trip, finds that 35 years have passed at home. Their parents may have died. Their friends may be entering retirement. The young have grown old. The world has not waited for them. Built into the speed of light is the structure of cause and effect. If any signal could travel faster than light in any reference frame, then in another reference frame, that same signal would arrive before it was sent. This is not a paradox in the sense of an unresolved puzzle. It is a structural fact of the geometry. Faster-than-light signaling and causality are incompatible. A universe that permitted one could not preserve the other. The universe appears to have chosen causality, and the speed of light is the consequence. This is why every proposed shortcut to interstellar travel runs into the same wall. Wormholes, warp drives, the Alcubierre family of metrics, faster-than-light tachyon signaling, hyperspace, subspace, the many fictional architectures that allow ships in stories to travel between stars in days or weeks. All of them require violations of the energy conditions that the universe appears to enforce. The mathematics that permit faster-than-light travel on paper require negative energy densities, exotic matter that has never been observed in macroscopic quantities, or violations of energy conditions that are considered structural to the geometry of space. The cleverness of the proposals is not in doubt. The cleverness of the universe in refusing them is the deeper fact. There is a quiet and patient body of theoretical work that attempts to find loopholes in the structure. Some researchers explore the possibility that quantum field theory permits small, transient violations of energy conditions, and that these might in principle be amplified into useful structures. Others explore the possibility that general relativity is incomplete, and that a deeper theory might permit configurations not allowed in the present framework. Still others explore the possibility that information might propagate through entanglement at a different speed than matter, though every experimental test so far has shown that entanglement cannot be used to send information at any speed, let alone above light. None of these directions has produced a practical concept. All of them remain open. The speed of light is also the speed of causality. Whatever is sent light, signal, particle, gravitational wave, travels along the boundary of what is reachable from a given point in space-time, and that boundary expands at exactly this speed. The light cone of a given event is the set of points in the future that can be influenced by that event, and its boundary is set by the speed of light. Inside the light cone, influence is possible. Outside it, influence is forbidden. This is not a limit on technology. It is a limit on what can be a consequence of what. There is something almost soothing about the fixedness of this limit. It does not move. It is not contingent. It does not depend on the year or the civilization or the engineer. It does not respond to ingenuity. It does not yield to wealth. It is, in a quiet way, the most democratic limit in the universe. The simplest microbe and the most advanced ship are bound by the same fence. The fence does not care which side of it you started on. The fence is just the fence. And yet inside the fence, the territory is enormous. There are tens of billions of stars in the home galaxy alone, distributed in a disk roughly 100,000 light-years across. There are perhaps 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe, separated by distances that grow in proportion to the time that has passed since the universe became transparent. A ship that could reach even 10% of the speed of light could, in principle, cross the home galaxy within 1,000,000 years. A ship that could reach 99% of the speed of light could, from its own frame, cross the galaxy within a working lifetime. The fence is real. The territory inside it is vast. There is a particular phenomenon that occurs near the speed of light, called relativistic aberration, that is worth dwelling on for its strange beauty. A ship traveling at very high velocity toward a destination sees the stars in front of it compressed into a smaller and smaller patch of sky directly ahead. The angle subtended by the forward hemisphere of stars narrows as the velocity approaches light. At 99% of light speed, the entire visible universe in front of the ship is compressed into a circle, perhaps 30 degrees across, with the rest of the sky behind the ship appearing dim and redshifted. The forward view becomes a bright, blue-shifted, concentrated disk. The rearward view becomes a dim, red-shifted shell. The geometry of motion at these speeds is itself a kind of optical phenomenon, present in any sufficiently fast ship, and the view from the bridge of such a vessel would be unlike anything any present-day astronaut has seen. A related phenomenon is the relativistic Doppler shift. Light from the destination star is blue-shifted as the ship approaches at high velocity. The destination star, observed from a ship traveling at 99% of light speed, appears not as a yellow star, but as an intense ultraviolet point. The light from the home star, looked at from behind, is redshifted into the infrared. The colors of the universe shift along with the velocity. This is not a special effect produced by the ship's instruments. It is a structural feature of the geometry of motion in spacetime. The colors really do change from the perspective of the ship, and the change is real. These features of high-velocity travel are honest predictions of relativity. They have been confirmed experimentally at lower velocities in particle accelerators, where the spectra of fast-moving particles shift in exactly the predicted ways. They would be encountered by any ship that approached the speed of light. They are part of the lived experience of any future high-velocity crewed crossing, should one ever be made. Part 5. Navigation, knowledge, and the lag of light. The fifth limit is gentler than the speed of light and less dramatic than biology, but it is no less binding. To travel anywhere in the universe, the traveler must first know where they are going. And the universe does not make this easy, because all knowledge of distant places arrives in the form of light, and light takes time. Every photograph of a distant world shows that world as it was when the light departed, not as it is now. Every map of the sky is a map of how the sky looked some number of years ago. Every catalogue of the positions of distant stars is a catalogue of where those stars were when the light reached the catalogue maker. The universe is an old image, not a current one. Close to Earth, the lag is short. From Earth to the Moon, light takes about 1¼ seconds one way, or 2½ seconds round trip. A signal sent to a probe on the lunar surface returns in less than 3 seconds. Conversations between Earth and the early lunar missions had a noticeable but workable delay, and crews on the surface could be advised in close to real time. The Moon is close, in the relevant sense. Earth and Moon share a clock for most practical purposes. From Earth to Mars, the lag depends on where Mars is in its orbit. At closest approach, when Earth and Mars are on the same side of the Sun, light takes about 4 minutes one way. At greatest distance, when Mars is on the far side of the Sun, light takes about 24 minutes one way. Round-trip communication with a probe on the Martian surface ranges from about 8 minutes to about 48 minutes. A rover driver cannot send a command and expect to see the result before stopping for tea. The rovers must be designed to operate semi-autonomously, with daily command sequences that the rover executes on its own and reports back at the end of the cycle. From Earth to Jupiter, light takes between 35 and 53 minutes one way, depending on orbital geometry. From Earth to Saturn, between 68 and 84. From Earth to Pluto, between 4 and 7 hours. From Earth to the heliopause, the boundary where the Sun's wind meets the interstellar medium, light takes roughly 21 hours. The 2 Voyager probes, drifting slowly outward through the interstellar medium, communicate with Earth across a one-way light delay of more than 20 hours each. A single command travels from Earth to the probe in nearly a day. The response from the probe back to Earth takes nearly another. A round-trip dialogue with the Voyagers takes nearly 2 days. From Earth to the nearest star, light takes more than 4 years. A signal sent to a hypothetical probe at the nearest star takes more than 4 years to arrive, and the response, if any, takes more than 4 years to return. A round trip is more than 8, is less than #0, 5# is greater than. Real-time control of any vehicle past the orbit of Mars becomes impossible. Past the orbit of Pluto, autonomous operation is the only option. Past the orbit of the nearest star, the vehicle must be its own ground control, its own engineering team, its own committee, its own civilization in miniature. The further the ship goes, the more it must contain everything it might need to know, because it cannot ask anyone outside the ship for the answer. This has practical consequences that go beyond the engineering of the vehicle. It means that the crew of a long-duration ship must be capable of independent decision-making at the level of an entire mission control. It means that the ship's library must include every piece of information that might be relevant, because there is no way to look up an answer in real time. It means that the crew must be trained in skills that, on Earth, are distributed across many specialists. A ship's doctor on a long mission must be trained in surgery, in obstetrics, in psychiatry, in pharmacy, in dentistry, in pathology, in immunology, in all the small specializations that an Earthside medical system distributes across many people. A ship's engineer must understand every system on the ship and be capable of repairing any of them with the materials available. The further the ship goes, the more demanding the requirements become, and the smaller the margin for error in the selection and training of the crew. To aim a ship at a distant star, the position of the star must be known to extraordinary precision. The standard tool is stellar parallax, the small annual shift in a star's apparent position as Earth moves around the Sun. By measuring the angle a star subtends from opposite sides of Earth's orbit, the distance to the star can be calculated using basic geometry. For nearby stars, parallax gives distances accurate to a few percent. For more distant stars, the parallax angle becomes smaller than the precision of any single instrument, and distances must be inferred from less direct methods: the apparent brightness of standard candles, the periods of certain pulsating stars, the redshift of distant galaxies. Each method has its own uncertainties and its own zero point. The cosmic distance ladder is built rung by rung, with each rung calibrated against the rung below. Even the position of the nearest star is known to a precision measured in fractions of a percent small in absolute terms, but enough that a ship traveling at high fraction of light speed across 4 years could miss its target unless it could correct course mid-flight. The error in distance translates to an error in arrival position. A few thousand kilometers of error in the position of the destination star, multiplied by the fraction of light speed the ship is traveling at, gives a window of arrival in space that may or may not include the target. The ship must be able to see the target in real time during the approach, calculate its own course correction, and execute it with enough margin to arrive at the desired point. The autonomy required is significant. Every star is also in motion through the galaxy. The nearest star is approaching the Sun at about 22 kilometers per second along the line of sight, and moving sideways through the sky at a few kilometers per second more. Over 40 years, it will be measurably closer at arrival than at departure, by about 30 billion kilometers along the line of sight. More distant targets move on more complex trajectories. The galaxy itself rotates, with stars at the radius of the Sun moving at about 220 kilometers per second around the galactic center. The solar system is moving through the local neighborhood at about 13 kilometers per second relative to the local standard of rest. A ship aimed at a distant star must aim at where the star will be when the ship arrives, not where it appears now. The aim is a calculation in the future, not the present. There is also the question of telemetry. A ship far from Earth must communicate back across a growing distance, and the strength of any signal falls with the square of the distance traveled. The Voyager probes, now beyond the heliopause, transmit at a power of about 23 watts, comparable to a refrigerator light bulb. The signal arriving at Earth is roughly a billionth of a watt, weaker than the radio noise from a single hydrogen atom in the deep sky. It is detected only because the receiving dishes on Earth are enormous. The receivers are cooled to within a few degrees of absolute zero, and the signal is integrated for long periods to pull it out of the noise. Even so, the data rate from the Voyagers is now measured in bits per second, and the time to download a single image of the kind these probes once took at Jupiter or Saturn would now stretch into hours or days. The lag of light is the quietest of the limits in this catalogue. It does not threaten the crew with death. It does not refuse the engine. It does not break the body. It only sets the pace at which knowledge moves. And in setting that pace, it changes the kind of mission that is possible. A crewed mission to another star is not a journey out and a journey back. It is a journey out, a long stay, and a return into a different civilization than the one that departed. There is something almost ceremonial about the lag of light when held the right way. The further the ship travels, the more the home becomes a memory, and the more the destination becomes the only present moment available to the crew. The civilization that launched the ship is, in a sense, no longer reachable. Only its old messages arrive, with a delay that grows with the distance traveled. The civilization at the destination, if any, is similarly only reachable through the old light of its past. The crew lives in a third frame, neither home nor destination, a frame defined by the ship itself and by the small community inside the hull. The crew becomes, in a quiet way, the only people whose present is genuinely shared with each other. This is one of the patient costs of crossing the gaps between stars. The crossing is not free. It costs not only fuel and food and shielding, but also the connection to any civilization the crew might claim. The ship becomes its own civilization, in a small way. Whether it remains in meaningful contact with the home is a function of distance and time, not of intent. The lag of light is also a slow attrition of belonging. The further the ship travels, the more it becomes its own home. Part 6. Civilizational Scale and the Politics of Time. The sixth limit is the easiest one to miss because it is not made of physics. It is made of patience, governance, and money. And these have boundaries every bit as real as the rocket equation. The boundaries are softer because they shift with culture and politics and accident, but they exist, and they constrain what a species at this stage of its development can choose to attempt. A robotic mission to the outer solar system takes more than a decade between approval and first data. The Cassini probe, sent to Saturn in the closing years of the 20th century, was conceived in the early 1980s, approved in the late 80s, launched in the late 90s, arrived at Saturn in the mid-2000s, and continued returning data for more than a decade afterward. 3 full generations of engineers worked on the project across its life. Some who were young engineers at the conception had retired before the spacecraft entered Saturn's orbit. The mission outlasted its own teams. A crewed mission to Mars, even under the most optimistic schedules, takes more than a decade between approval and return. The flight time alone is a year and a half, divided into a 6-month outbound crossing, an extended surface stay, and a 6-month return. The preparation time, including the development of the launch vehicle, the habitat, the surface infrastructure, the life support systems, and the crew training, dwarfs the flight time. A serious Mars program is a 15 to 20-year project from the moment the funding line opens. Such a program crosses multiple administrations of any plausible democratic government, multiple budget cycles, multiple changes in priorities, multiple replacements of senior leadership. A crewed mission to another star, under any plausible architecture, takes longer than the working life of any single engineer. The construction time for a serious interstellar vehicle, even with optimistic propulsion assumptions, runs into many decades. The flight time, even at significant fractions of light speed, runs into many more. The total time from the moment funding begins to the moment a crew returns to Earth is measured in centuries. No institution on Earth has demonstrated the capacity to sustain a single coherent engineering project across centuries. This is not because humans are incapable of long-duration commitment. The great cathedrals of Europe were built across centuries by communities that knew their grandchildren would not live to see the spires raised. The Great Wall of China was extended across more than 1,000 years by successive dynasties. The longest railway systems in the world were planned and built across generations. The capacity exists. What does not yet exist is an institution dedicated to long-duration space engineering that has demonstrated the same patience. The Voyager probes are a small and instructive example. They were built by a team of engineers, many of whom are no longer alive. The software that decodes their telemetry has been maintained by a long-tenured small team. Twice the spacecraft's onboard memory has been patched across light hours of distance by engineers improvising fixes for hardware that was designed before the personal computer existed. The original documentation, much of it on paper, has been preserved, organized, and redigitized as new generations of engineers took up the work. Each fix has required not only the documentation of the original system, but the continuous chain of people who understand it. When the last person who worked on the original design retires, a certain kind of fix becomes impossible. Not because the documentation has been lost, but because the understanding that lived in the gaps between the documents has gone with the people who carried it. Sustaining a mission for 100 years requires a different kind of institution than sustaining one for 10. Sustaining a mission for 1,000 years requires an institution that does not yet exist anywhere on Earth. Some research groups have begun to think about how such institutions might be designed. There are early proposals for long-duration mission organizations modeled on monastic orders, with explicit succession plans, dedicated funding endowments, and rituals for the transmission and of technical knowledge between generations. None has been tested at scale. The question of whether a small, dedicated organization can maintain coherent technical work across many human generations is open. The economics of large ships is the second piece of the civilizational limit. A large, crewed interstellar vessel, even a small one, would be one of the most expensive engineering projects in human history. Estimates vary across orders of magnitude, but at the small end, sending a few people to another star using fusion or beamed energy concepts would cost roughly 1% of present global gross output for a single mission. At the high end, generation ship concepts have been estimated at many times global gross output, sustained across decades of construction. The numbers depend strongly on the propulsion architecture, the ship size, and the destination. A small, fast probe to the nearest star, using beamed energy light sail concepts, might cost tens of billions of present-day units of currency. A medium crewed vessel using fusion concepts might cost tens of trillions. A large world ship, for thousands of crew, built over decades, might cost more than the present annual global economy. The numbers are not absurd. They are large but not absurd. A civilization with global economic output an order of magnitude greater than the present, one could afford a medium crewed vessel without straining itself. A civilization with output 2 orders of magnitude greater could afford a fleet. The question is not only whether the energy and materials can be assembled, it is whether a civilization can sustain the political will to fund a project across the working lives of multiple administrations, the careers of multiple generations of engineers, and shifts in priorities that will inevitably emerge across that long span. The limit is patience at the scale of nations. The Apollo program, the largest single peacetime engineering project in human history, sustained its political support across about a decade and was wound down at a point that was, in retrospect, premature. Many of the engineers who built the program found themselves looking for new work in their 40s, with skills that the world had not yet developed a sustained appetite for. There is a curious mathematical observation about long voyages that deserves attention here. If propulsion technology is improving rapidly, then a ship launched today is overtaken by a faster ship launched later. There exists, for any given destination and any given rate of technological improvement, a date before which any departure is foolish, a date at which patience pays off, and a date after which further waiting is wasted. This was first described in detail by an engineer who worked through the arithmetic and has been called the Kennedy weight calculation ever since. The arithmetic of the calculation is quiet and patient. Assume a destination at distance d. Assume a present propulsion technology that delivers velocity v at construction time t equals 0. Assume that propulsion technology improves at a rate such that velocity available at construction time t is v multiplied by a function of t. Solve for the construction time at which the total travel time from now is minimized, including both construction time and flight time. The answer is a function of the rate of improvement. If improvement is slow, the optimal departure is now. If improvement is fast, the optimal departure is later, sometimes much later. The first ship to leave for another star may be the one that does not arrive first. The earliest movers may be overtaken in transit by later ships built with faster engines. This is sometimes presented as a paradox. It is better understood as a quiet observation about the relationship between technological progress and the patience of those who choose when to depart. A civilization confident in continued propulsion improvement is rational to wait. A civilization uncertain of its own future is rational to leave sooner. The calculation introduces a kind of game-theoretic consideration into the interstellar question, one that is unfamiliar in everyday engineering but is real and is sometimes binding. The civilizational limit is, in a sense, the most binding of all the limits in this catalogue. The rocket equation can be raised by climbing the propulsion ladder. The body can be mitigated by countermeasures. The speed of light cannot be exceeded, but can be approached. The lag of light requires autonomy, but not impossibility. The patience and coherence of a civilization across centuries, however, is not yet demonstrated, and may not be demonstrated for some time. The question of whether the species can become the kind of civilization that builds and sustains interstellar projects is, in many ways, the central question of the interstellar program. The engine is the easy part. The institution is the hard one. This is the quiet observation that sits beneath every interstellar architecture, and it deserves to be heard before the catalogue continues. Part 7. Cosmological Horizons. The seventh limit is the largest one and the most absolute. It is set not by chemistry or biology or politics, or even by the speed of light alone, but by the geometry of the universe at its grandest scale, and by the fact that the universe is expanding, that the expansion is accelerating, and that the most distant places are receding from this one, faster than light reaches them. The cage that contains every conceivable journey is finite, and its boundary recedes in a particular and patient way that limits which destinations are, even in principle, reachable from this point in space-time. The observable universe is the region from which light has had time to reach a particular observer since the universe became transparent. Its radius is roughly 46 billion light-years, though the universe is only about 13.8 billion years old. The discrepancy comes from the steady expansion of space itself, across the time the light has been traveling. The galaxies whose light is arriving now were closer when the light left them, and they have been carried farther away by the expansion of the intervening space ever since. The light arrives from where the galaxies were. The galaxies themselves are now farther. Everything inside that observable region is, in principle, visible to the observer now. Light from the most distant visible galaxies has been traveling for nearly the full age of the universe. The first galaxies, observed at the highest redshifts, are seen as they were when the universe was only a few 100 million years old. The cosmic microwave background, the oldest visible light, is seen as it was when the universe was about 380,000 years old. Beyond that, the universe is opaque because hydrogen and helium had not yet combined into neutral atoms, and the universe was a fog of charged particles through which no photon could travel freely. Inside the observable universe sits a smaller and more practically important horizon. The cosmic event horizon is the boundary beyond which no signal launched from Earth today can ever reach. It exists because the expansion of the universe is accelerating, and the rate at which distant galaxies are receding grows faster than a signal sent from here can close. The horizon is currently around 15 to 16 billion light-years away. Galaxies beyond that distance are receding from us faster than light can reach them. A photon sent from Earth today, traveling at exactly the speed of light, would never arrive at those galaxies. The space between us is growing too fast. Galaxies inside the event horizon are reachable in principle, though not in practice, by signals sent now. Galaxies outside the event horizon are not reachable at all by any signals sent now or in the future. They remain visible because their old light is still arriving, but the connection is one way. They can be seen but not signaled. They can be observed but not addressed. The universe is generous about what it shows. It is strict about what it can be told. This horizon is not static. It moves outward, slowly, over time, as the universe ages. But it also loses galaxies, because the accelerating expansion carries more and more matter past it. The total number of galaxies that can ever be reached from a given point in spacetime is a finite and shrinking quantity. Over the next 100 billion years, the accelerating expansion will carry essentially every galaxy outside the local group past the cosmic event horizon. The visible universe will slowly shrink from the observer's perspective to the cluster of galaxies gravitationally bound to our own. In the very deep future, the most distant visible objects will be the dimming red glow of the local group's own galaxies, slowly aging together as one. This is one of the quiet inversions of cosmology. The universe is largest, from a practical perspective, in its early adolescence. The number of galaxies that could, in principle, be visited from a given point in spacetime is currently several hundred. In the past, it was more. In the future, it will be fewer. The fraction of the universe that is reachable from here is slowly decreasing. The reachable cosmos is contracting around the observer, not because the universe is shrinking, but because the observer's island is being separated from the rest of the archipelago by the rising tide of expansion. There is something deeply patient about this limit. It does not affect any journey contemplated on any human timescale. The local group itself is a cluster of dozens of galaxies, with our own Milky Way and the Andromeda Galaxy as the two large members, and the cluster is bound together gravitationally tightly enough that it will not be carried apart by the expansion. A ship that could move at any meaningful fraction of light speed would have access to the local group for the deep future, regardless of what the expansion does. The cluster will collapse together over the next 10 billion years or so, with the Milky Way and Andromeda merging into a single elliptical galaxy, and the smaller members folding in over longer timescales. The local group will be the home neighborhood for as long as there are stars to make the home neighborhood meaningful. Beyond the local group sits a slow withdrawal. The Virgo cluster, the largest cluster nearby, is currently being carried away by expansion despite its own internal gravity. The cluster has not yet been pulled past the event horizon, but it is moving in that direction. The more distant clusters, the Coma cluster, the Perseus cluster, the Hercules supercluster, are receding more rapidly still. In the deep future, an observer standing in the merged Milky Way Andromeda elliptical will see the sky empty, slowly, of all but the closest companions. The night sky of a planet around a future star in the local group will be sparser than ours, with fewer distant galaxies visible, fewer faint smears of light hanging between the bright stars. This is the cosmic limit on what can ever be visited from this point in space-time. It is real. It is final. It is set by the expansion of the universe itself, by the cosmological constant, by the dark energy that drives the acceleration, by the structure of the metric that defines distance and time at the largest scales. No engine can defeat it. No civilization can negotiate with it. No future technology, no matter how advanced, can extend the cosmic event horizon. The boundary is the boundary, and yet it sits inconceivably far from where any practical ship now sits. Even the most ambitious interstellar plans currently being studied aim at destinations a few light years away, inside a galaxy that is itself only 100,000 light years across. The cosmic event horizon is 15 to 16 billion light years away. The reachable universe, by any measure, is enormously larger than the part of it that any current civilization could plausibly visit within the lifetime of any species. The cage is finite. The territory inside the cage is essentially infinite for any practical purpose. There is a quiet dignity to this arrangement. The universe holds back a fraction of itself, beyond the reach of any observer at any time. But it offers the rest, generously and patiently. A civilization that learns to cross the gaps between stars will find that there are more stars than any civilization could ever visit. A civilization that learns to cross the gaps between galaxies will find that there are more galaxies than any civilization could ever visit. The limit is real. But the limit is so much larger than the reach of any reasonable ambition that, for any practical question about where a ship might go in the next 100 million years, the limit might as well not exist. This is the seventh limit, and it is the largest. It is the cosmic event horizon, the patient slow recession of the most distant matter, the soft edge of what is in principle reachable from this point in space-time. The universe is open at every angle except the one that points toward the horizon itself. And the horizon points outward in every direction at once, so the open angles are all the angles, more or less. It is worth dwelling on the strangeness of a horizon that recedes faster than light reaches it. In every other physical setting, a horizon is a fixed boundary, defined by the geometry of the situation. The horizon of a planet's surface, set by the planet's curvature. The horizon of a black hole, set by the gravitational mass inside it. The horizon of an ocean, set by the curvature of the Earth. The cosmic event horizon is different. It is a boundary defined by the relationship between two ongoing processes, the steady speed of light and the accelerating expansion of space. Neither process is itself a horizon. The horizon emerges from the relationship between them. This means, in a quiet way, that the horizon is a feature of the present cosmology, not of the underlying geometry alone. If the expansion of the universe were to change character in the future, if the cosmological constant were to evolve, if dark energy were to behave differently than current models predict, if the expansion were to slow or reverse, the horizon would change with it. Some cosmological models contemplate exactly this kind of slow change. Most current observations are consistent with a steady cosmological constant, but the precision of the measurements continues to improve, and a small change in the rate of expansion would shift the horizon in noticeable ways. The horizon is not unambiguously fixed forever. It is fixed under the current best understanding of the cosmology. There is also the matter of what happens at the horizon itself. Galaxies receding from the observer at exactly the speed of light sit, in a sense, on the horizon. Galaxies just inside it are reachable, in principle, by signals sent today. Galaxies just outside it are not. The boundary is not sharp in any practical sense. It sweeps slowly outward over cosmic time, and the galaxies just outside it now will, in the deep future, be carried even further away. The horizon is a soft boundary that hardens over time. The reachable set is monotonically decreasing for any observer. Some galaxies that are reachable today will not be reachable in 100 billion years. The reachable cosmos is, slowly and patiently, contracting. Part 8. Philosophical reframes. The eighth limit is not a limit in the usual sense. It is a question about what counts as having arrived. Several quiet reframings of the interstellar question have appeared across the long history of the discussion, and each one loosens the binding of the engineering limits by changing what the traveler is. The reframings are not tricks. They are honest reconsiderations of what travel is, what arrival means, who the traveler must be, and what the journey is for. Each reframe opens a different door inside the cage. The first reframe is the robotic one. If the goal is to have a tool reach another star, then a small unmanned probe is plausible within the next century or so. The probe does not breathe, or eat, or remember Earth. It does not require a closed life support loop, a radiation shelter, a hibernation system, or a generation of children. It does not require an arrival to be meaningful. It only requires that the data it gathers travels back. Concepts of this kind have been studied seriously for decades. Small probes weighing grams rather than tons, pushed by laser arrays on a planet, accelerating gently across minutes to a significant fraction of the speed of light, drifting for decades toward a destination star, returning faint signals across the gap when they arrive. All of this is within the envelope of what could be engineered with concentrated effort over the next several decades. The probe does not arrive in the sense that a human crew would arrive. There is no welcome ceremony, no flag, no footprint, no first words spoken on the surface. The probe simply executes its program: take measurements, look around, transmit. The destination does not know the probe is there. The probe does not, in any meaningful sense, know it is at the destination. It is a small package of instruments, doing what it was built to do, 8 light-years away from anyone who cares about the data. And yet some thinkers count this as a form of arrival. Others do not. The argument is not new, and it will not be settled by argument. It is settled by what the species decides to count. The second reframe is the informational one. If the goal is to send a mind across the gap, there are concepts under which the mind itself is transmitted as information, a digital scan, a pattern of memories and personality, beamed at the speed of light to a receiver at the destination that reconstructs it in new hardware. The body never moves. The mind, if such a transmission is ever shown to preserve identity, arrives at light speed without aging. The receiving state, of course, must be there first, which means that some other vehicle, perhaps a probe, perhaps an automated builder, must have arrived before the transmission can be received. The architecture requires a slow setup followed by a fast crossing of all subsequent travelers. These concepts depend on deep, open questions about whether a copied or transmitted mind is the same mind, and whether the experience of self is preserved by a faithful pattern. The questions are not new in philosophy, and they remain genuinely unresolved. A perfect copy of a mind that is reconstructed from a transmission might be, in some sense, the same person as the original. It might also be a new person who happens to remember being the original. The two possibilities are not distinguishable from the inside or the outside. The neuroscience of consciousness is incomplete, and the philosophical questions sit on top of the incomplete neuroscience. No transmission of a mind has ever been attempted. The concept is theoretical only. The third reframe is the world ship. If the goal is for a community to live among the stars, the architecture changes from a fast ship aimed at a destination to a slow ship that is itself a destination. A world ship is a small city, self-sustaining, traveling across the gap on a timescale measured in tens of thousands of years. The inhabitants do not see arrival as the meaningful event. The journey is the home. The children born on the ship will live and die on the ship, as will their children, and their children's children, and so on for the duration of the crossing. Arrival is something that happens to a distant ancestor's descendants. It is a destination for the family line, not for any individual. In this reframe, the question shifts from how fast can we go to how slowly can we travel, and still call it travel. The limit moves from the engine to the ecology of the ship and the durability of the culture inside it. A world ship requires not only closed-loop life support, radiation shielding, and propulsion. It requires a stable society able to maintain itself across hundreds of generations without losing its way. The political, cultural, and educational systems on board must be designed for permanence. The cargo includes the libraries of human civilization, but also the ways of teaching them, the rituals that preserve the culture, the diversity of trades and skills required to repair every system on board, and the genetic diversity required to keep the population healthy across the long stretch. The world ship is not a fast vehicle. It is a slow one. But it is the architecture under which the fewest engineering miracles are required. Chemical or low-grade nuclear propulsion is sufficient to set a world ship on its course. The ship spends almost all of its time coasting. The crossing time is long, but the daily life of the crew is no more demanding than the daily life of a small town. The world ship turns the interstellar question into a question of community endurance, rather than a question of propulsion or energy. Some thinkers consider this the most plausible architecture for permanent human presence beyond the solar system. Others consider it a counsel of despair, a way of admitting that the engine cannot be beaten and the body cannot be hibernated, and the only path forward is to accept the long crossing as a home. The fourth reframe is deep time. If the goal is for life to exist among the stars, the calendar widens further. Across 100,000 years, even a slow ship, moving at less than 1,000th of the speed of light, reaches the nearest star. Across 1,000,000 years, the entire solar neighborhood becomes reachable. Across 1 billion, the galaxy. The universe is generous with time. It is patience that is in short supply, not opportunity. A species capable of holding a long-term project across geological time could, in principle, populate every habitable world in the Milky Way using only existing propulsion technology, given enough centuries. This is the longest reframe, and the one that requires the least engineering. It is also the one that requires the most patience. No human institution has ever sustained itself across the kind of time the deep time reframe contemplates. The oldest continuously operating institutions on Earth, certain monasteries, certain universities, certain governments, are barely a millennium old. The deep time reframe asks for institutions that last hundreds of times longer than the oldest currently existing ones. Whether such institutions are possible and what shape they would have to take is one of the deeper questions in long-duration planning. The reframes share a common pattern. Each one widens the boundary of what counts as travel. Each one substitutes patience for engineering, or substitutes a different sort of traveler for the unchanged human body. Each one trades the question of how to beat the speed of light for the question of what to do about the speed of light. The engine sets a hard ceiling. The reframes shift the ceiling by changing the question, not by changing the engineering. There is a softness inside the reframes that is worth dwelling on. The hard limits of physics do not change with how the question is asked. The energy required to accelerate a body, the radiation a crew accumulates, the geometry of the speed of light, the cosmic event horizon, these are fixed. The reframes do not move them, but they move the place where the limit binds. A robot bypasses the body. A transmission bypasses the propulsion. A world ship bypasses the speed of light by accepting the long crossing. A deep time program bypasses the propulsion entirely by trading it for patience. The cage stays the same shape. The traveler inside it changes. This is the 8th limit. It is the limit of who the traveler must be. And it is not a fixed limit. It is a choice. Different choices give different answers to the title of this documentary. The engine is not the only variable. The question itself is a variable, and the answer changes depending on how the question is asked. A 5th reframe deserves a brief mention before this section closes. It is sometimes called the post-biological reframe. Under this view, the long-term descendants of the species may not be biological at all. The intelligence that crosses the gaps between stars may be a machine intelligence, or a hybrid of biological and machine, or something else for which the species does not yet have a vocabulary. Such an intelligence may be far more durable than the biological body. It may tolerate radiation better, microgravity better, isolation better. It may operate on slower timescales, without distress. It may consider a 1,000-year crossing the equivalent of an afternoon walk. Whether such intelligences ever come into being, and whether their relationship to the present species is one of continuity or replacement, is a question the present generation is not in a position to answer. But it is a real possibility, and it changes the calculus of what travel means. The reframes, taken together, suggest that the interstellar question is less about engineering than it first appears, and more about what the species decides to count. The cage is fixed. The traveler inside the cage is a choice. Different choices give different answers. The species has the rare freedom given to no other animal, to choose what kind of traveler it wants to be. This is a small but real consolation in the face of the harder physics. The cage is not the only thing in the room. The traveler is also in the room, and the traveler can be changed. Part 9. The difference between cannot and have not yet. The ninth family of limits is the soft line between absolute and contingent. Some of the limits in this documentary are settled. Others are not. The discipline of the field and the discipline of any honest thinker who picks up the question is to know which is which. To treat a contingent limit as absolute is to give up too early. To treat an absolute limit as contingent is to chase mirages. The interstellar question has been polluted across the centuries by both errors in roughly equal measure. What is absolute? First, the speed of light is absolute. No mass-bearing object can reach it. No information can travel faster than light through normal space. The equations of motion in the geometry of space-time forbid both, and every experimental test conducted across the past century has confirmed the prediction to extraordinary precision. There is no plausible engineering project, no technological breakthrough, no clever architecture that will raise this ceiling. The ceiling is part of the structure of reality. Causality is absolute. Any successful shortcut to faster-than-light signaling would generate paradoxes that the universe appears to forbid. A signal that arrived before it was sent would create logical inconsistencies that the geometry of space-time is structured to prevent. Every proposed faster-than-light architecture is, at its core, a proposal to break causality. The universe, by every indication, has chosen causality and the speed of light over either alternative, and there is no indication that the choice will be revisited. The cosmic event horizon is absolute under current cosmology. Galaxies beyond it cannot be reached from this point in space-time, even in principle. The horizon is a consequence of the accelerating expansion of the universe, and the expansion is driven by what is called dark energy. The mechanism is not fully understood. The phenomenon is well measured. There is a small possibility that future physics will reveal the nature of dark energy and find that the expansion behaves differently than current models predict. But under any of the credible models, a cosmic event horizon of some kind exists, and it sits at a distance comparable to the one currently estimated. The galaxies beyond it cannot be reached. Energy conservation is absolute. The total energy required to accelerate a body to a given speed is set by mass-energy equivalence and cannot be reduced. The arithmetic does not depend on the engineering. The ship at half the speed of light requires a certain amount of kinetic energy. The ship at 99% of the speed of light requires roughly 7 times more. There is no architecture that lowers this number. The only way to reduce the energy cost is to reduce the mass of the ship or to reduce the desired velocity. The arithmetic is fixed. Mass energy equivalence itself is absolute. The maximum energy obtainable from any matter is set by E equals mc squared, approximately 90 quadrillion joules per kilogram. No matter, no chemistry, no nuclear process, no exotic state of matter can yield more energy per unit mass than this. Antimatter, fusion, fission, all of them are bounded by this ceiling. There is no rung above antimatter on the energy ladder. These 5 limits are the absolute ones. They are the structural features of reality, not the limits of present technology. They will not be raised. The ceiling they describe is the actual ceiling. Inside the ceiling, the territory is enormous, but the ceiling itself is fixed. Now the contingent. The energy budget of human civilization is contingent. It has grown by orders of magnitude over the past 3 centuries and may continue to grow. A century ago, the total energy consumption of human civilization was less than 10% of what it is now. A century from now, it may be 10 times what it is now. A millennium from now, the budget could be 1,000 times the present figure, or it could be smaller than the present figure. The trajectory depends on choices, on resources, on accidents, on whether the species solves its current resource constraints, and on whether new energy sources become available. The number itself is not fixed by physics. It is fixed by the choices the species makes. The mass ratio of a chemical rocket is contingent. Better staging, in-orbit refueling, aero capture, lightweight materials, and improved engine efficiency can shift the practical envelope without changing the underlying chemistry. A chemical rocket designed and built today is significantly more capable per unit mass than one designed and built 50 years ago. Further improvements are possible. The chemistry sets the ceiling, but the chemistry does not currently sit at its own ceiling. There is room to climb within the cage. The biological tolerance of the human body is contingent. Genetic modification, pharmaceutical countermeasures, hibernation, embryo storage, and machine-mediated repair are all areas under active research. None has been demonstrated for long-duration crewed missions. Each has the potential to extend the boundary of what a body can endure. A body modified to better tolerate microgravity, radiation, or isolation might be capable of crossings that are not possible for the present unmodified body. The ethical and practical questions are large. The technical possibility is not zero. The political will to fund long-duration missions is contingent. It has waxed and waned across centuries and may do either in the future. The Apollo program demonstrated that a serious crewed program can be sustained for about a decade under sufficient political pressure. The Voyager program demonstrated that a small robotic program can be sustained for decades on a much smaller budget. Whether longer programs can be sustained is a question of governance and culture, not of physics. The answer may turn out to be yes or no, or somewhere in between, depending on what kinds of institutions the species learns to build. Propulsion technology is contingent. Antimatter production, fusion reactors, beamed energy infrastructure, and concepts not yet proposed could shift the practical limits without changing the underlying physics. The ladder from chemistry to antimatter is not closed at any rung. The rungs are simply not yet climbed at industrial scale. Each rung represents an enormous engineering project, but none of the rungs is forbidden by physics. The climbing has not yet been done. The discipline of the distinction is to keep these two columns clearly separate. To treat the contingent as if it were absolute is to give up too early. To treat the absolute as if it were contingent is to chase mirages. Most of what feels like a hard limit on space travel is in fact contingent. A small handful of hard limits, the speed of light, causality, the cosmic event horizon, mass energy equivalence, are not. This is the quiet payoff to the title of this documentary. The true limits of space travel are surprisingly few, and they are surprisingly far from where the question first lands. The ceiling is not where the species currently sits. The ceiling is much higher than where the species sits. The space between the present condition and the absolute limits is enormous, and most of it is open territory. The fence around the human species is real, and the boundary of that fence has been mapped in considerable detail. But the fence is not where the species lives. The species lives in a small village inside an enormous garden. The fence around the garden is the speed of light, the cosmic event horizon, the geometry of space-time. The village inside the fence has barely begun to expand. The first generation that left the surface of the planet did so within living memory of people now still alive. The first probe to cross the heliopause did so less than 50 years from the date of this documentary. The first deliberate crossing of an interstellar gap by a crewed vessel may or may not happen within the next millennium. But the gap itself is not a wall. The gap is a slope, and the slope is climbable. It is worth saying this clearly, because the rhetoric around space travel sometimes drifts toward either of the two errors. Some speakers treat the speed of light as a temporary inconvenience that future physics will solve. It will not. Other speakers treat the present chemical rocket as the ceiling of human ambition. It is not. The truth sits between the two. The ceiling is real and far away. The floor is real and close. The territory between them is the territory of the next several centuries of serious space engineering, and that territory is wide open. Part 10. The Quiet Catalogue of Limits. Held together in one view, the catalogue of limits has a particular shape. The absolute limits are few and fixed. The contingent limits are many and slowly shifting. The reframes are several and chosen by the observer. The whole structure is laid down here as one calm inventory, so the listener can hold the geometry of the question in mind before the closing reframe arrives. The absolute limits. First, the speed of light, about 300,000 kilometers per second, is the ceiling for any mass-bearing object and for any information-carrying signal in normal space. Causality, the requirement that cause precede effect in every reference frame, is the consequence of the speed of light and forbids any architecture that would beat it. The cosmic event horizon, currently around 15 to 16 billion light-years, is the boundary beyond which no signal launched from here today can ever reach. Mass-energy equivalence, the equation that sets the maximum energy obtainable per unit mass, caps every conceivable propulsion architecture at about 90 quadrillion joules per kilogram. Energy conservation itself, the structural feature of physics that ensures the books always balance, sets the unavoidable energy cost of any given acceleration. These 5 limits do not move. The practical engineering limits, next. The rocket equation sets the ceiling on what chemical propellants can achieve. And that ceiling is high enough to reach Mars, but not high enough to reach the nearest star. The specific impulse of chemical propellants tops out at around 450 seconds, with exhaust velocities of about 4.5 kilometers per second. Ion drives reach exhaust velocities of 20 to 50 kilometers per second, but with very low thrust. Nuclear thermal and nuclear electric concepts can roughly double or further improve on chemistry. Fusion propulsion, if demonstrated, could reach exhaust velocities of a few thousand kilometers per second, approaching 1% of light. Antimatter propulsion could in principle reach exhaust velocities close to light itself, but the production cost is currently many orders of magnitude greater than the energy stored. Beamed energy propulsion is favorable for gram-scale probes, but punishing for crewed vessels at present civilizational energy budgets. The biological limits, next. Microgravity, sustained for months and years, produces bone density loss of about 1% per month from weight-bearing bones, muscle loss, fluid shifts, vision changes, immune system shifts, and cardiovascular remodeling. Radiation exposure outside the magnetosphere accumulates from galactic cosmic rays continuously and from solar energetic particle events episodically. Shielding mitigates, but does not eliminate the burden. Closed-loop life support has not yet been demonstrated indefinitely. Current systems recover most water and some oxygen, but rely on regular ground resupply for food and consumables. Crew psychology over multi-year crossings remains an open question. The small population studied so far has not yet been pushed to the durations contemplated for interstellar crossings. Generation timescales require minimum viable populations of several hundred breeding individuals, stable culture, and stable governance across many generations. The knowledge and navigation limits. Next. Light time lag scales with distance from Earth, about 1 second for the Moon, 4 to 24 minutes for Mars, more than 4 years for the nearest star. Position uncertainty of distant stars limits the precision of any aim. Even the nearest star is known to a precision that requires mid-flight correction for any high-velocity crossing. The motion of target stars across the journey time requires aiming at where the star will be on arrival, not where it appears now. The decay of telemetry strength over distance limits the data rate achievable from distant probes. Past the orbit of Mars, autonomous operation becomes essential because real-time control is impossible. The civilizational limits. Next. Mission lifetimes longer than the working careers of engineers require institutions capable of transmitting technical knowledge across generations. Institutional memory required to maintain decades-old hardware demands continuous chains of trained personnel. Funding stability across multiple political administrations is required for long-duration projects. Material and energy budgets, at the scale of small nations or larger, are required for the most ambitious architectures. The Kennedy weight calculation introduces a game-theoretic question about optimal departure timing. In a regime of rapid propulsion improvement, the rational departure date may be far in the future, not now. The cosmological limits. Next. The cosmic event horizon sits at about 15 to 16 billion light-years and is the boundary beyond which signals sent today cannot reach. The accelerating expansion of the universe will carry more matter past this horizon over deep time. The reachable universe is slowly shrinking from the perspective of any observer, though the change is imperceptible on any human timescale. In the very deep future, the visible universe will consist only of the local group, slowly aging together as a single bound system. The philosophical reframes. Finally. The robotic reframe substitutes a small instrument package for a human crew, shifting the burden from biology to engineering. The informational reframe substitutes the transmission of a mind for the transmission of a body, shifting the burden from propulsion to neuroscience and to the philosophy of identity. The world ship reframe substitutes a slow city for a fast ship, shifting the burden from propulsion to community endurance. The deep time reframe substitutes a long calendar for a short one, shifting the burden from engineering to institutional patience. Each reframe opens a different door. Each chooses a different traveler. Each accepts a different cost. The catalogue is honest. It does not pretend that the limits are smaller than they are. It does not pretend that the limits are larger than they are. It lays each one down beside the next, with its character clearly marked. Absolute or contingent, hard or soft, engineering or biological or philosophical. The shape of the question becomes visible only when the whole inventory is held in view at once. There is something quietly clarifying about the inventory. The fence around the species is not a single fence. It is a set of fences, with different heights and different materials and different gates. The fence of the speed of light is tall and made of geometry. The fence of biology is shorter and made of evolution. The fence of money is shorter still and made of the choices of nations. The fence of the rocket equation is set by chemistry and can be climbed by changing the fuel. The fence of the cosmic event horizon is the boundary of the garden itself and cannot be climbed at all, but sits so far from where the species currently lives that the climb has not yet become a practical question. Inside the inventory, the listener can locate the various claims that drift through the discourse around space travel. The claim that the species will never leave the solar system is wrong. The claim that the species will soon visit other galaxies is also wrong. The claim that faster-than-light travel is just around the corner of future physics is wrong. The claim that the speed of light is a paper limit that engineering will eventually beat is wrong. The claim that the present chemical rocket represents the maximum of human ambition is wrong. The truth, where it can be found, sits between these claims. It is more interesting than any of them. It is also less dramatic. It does not lend itself to clean headlines. It requires holding the inventory in mind as one structured set, with the absolute fences distinguished from the contingent ones. The catalogue is also, in a quiet way, an invitation. The contingent limits are projects. They are work waiting to be done. They are the next several centuries of careful engineering and patient institution building. The absolute limits are the structure of the universe. They do not require attention. The structure is the structure. The work is the work. The catalogue tells the listener where to point attention. Most of the attention should go to the contingent limits, because those are where progress is possible. Some attention should go to the absolute limits, because those are where the imagination should rest at the end of the day, in honest acknowledgement of what cannot be done. This is the 10th section, and it is the bookkeeping section, the patient inventory, the catalogue laid down so the closing reframe has something to rest on. The list itself is not the answer. The list is the table on which the answer is placed. Part 11. The cage is larger than it looks. Held all together, the catalogue of limits is honest but generous. The hard ceiling, the speed of light, keeps the species inside one galaxy on human timescales, and inside a few thousand galaxies on civilizational timescales. Inside that ceiling, the rest of the limits are soft. Each of them has been pushed before. Each may be pushed again. The shape of the cage is, on close inspection, not the shape the question first suggests. The cage is much larger than the village inside it, and the walls of the village are not the walls of the cage. The most binding limit on space travel today is not relativity. It is the energy budget of a single planet, the working lives of its engineers, and the patience of its institutions. These are the walls that touch the body of the question right now. The species lives at the bottom of its own gravity well, on a small world, with an economy that is currently only beginning to think in terms of multi-century projects. The fences that bind the species at the moment are not the fences of the universe. They are the fences of the present civilization. The further walls are real, but they sit a long way past the present condition, and most of the space between the present and the further walls is open. The species has begun to walk outward. A small probe has crossed the heliopause. A handful of bodies have stood briefly on the surface of the Moon. Several rovers are exploring the surface of Mars. A small number of long-duration crews have spent more than a year continuously in low Earth orbit. These are the first careful steps of a species that is, in a quiet way, beginning to learn to walk. The next walls are visible from where the species stands. The journey to a permanent presence on Mars is technically possible within the present century. The journey to a sustained presence on the Moon is closer. The first crewed missions to the outer planets, perhaps to the moons of Jupiter or Saturn, are achievable within a century or two. The first robotic probe to another star is plausible within the same window. The first crewed crossing of an interstellar gap is centuries away under any honest accounting, but the centuries are not impossible centuries. They are simply long ones. Beyond the centuries sit the millennia, and beyond the millennia sit the deep time options that the 8th section considered. A species capable of holding a long-term project across thousands of years could, in principle, populate every habitable world in the Milky Way using only existing or near-existing propulsion technology, given enough patience. The propulsion is not the binding constraint at that timescale. The patience is. Whether the species develops the institutions capable of holding such patience is a question for the next several generations, not for the engineers of any current laboratory. This is the quiet truth that lives under the title of this documentary. The question is not whether the species can ever leave. The question is what kind of leaving counts. A small probe at 1% of light speed leaves. A signal containing the pattern of a mind leaves at light itself. A small city moving slowly across 10,000 years leaves. A civilization choosing to wait for a faster engine leaves later but arrives sooner. A single body inside a ship aimed at the nearest star leaves and returns to a sun a little dimmer and a population that has moved on. Every one of these is a kind of arrival, and the universe is not closed to any of them. The walls of the cage are real. The interior of the cage is enormous. The species lives in a small village at the center of a vast garden, and the garden has been waiting patiently for the village to learn to walk. The walls of the village are not the walls of the garden. The walls of the garden are not the walls of the cage. The walls of the cage sit at distances that have no practical relevance to any project the species could undertake in the next many generations. The space available is, by any reasonable measure, essentially infinite. The species has barely begun to explore the first acre. There is a quiet patience to the whole structure. The universe does not rush. It does not demand. It does not promise. It simply waits. The fences are where they are. The territory inside the fences is what it is. The species can walk outward at whatever pace it chooses, on whatever schedule it can sustain, with whatever architectures it learns to build. The garden does not close its gates. The garden has many gates, and most of them are open. It is worth ending this catalogue with a particular image. The image is of a small probe, perhaps no larger than a coin, drifting through the long dark between two stars. The probe was launched many years ago from a planet that is now somewhere over its left shoulder. The destination is somewhere over its right. There is no rush. The probe is moving at a fraction of the speed of light that would seem slow to a poet, but would seem extraordinary to anyone who has tried to build a rocket. Around the probe, the universe behaves exactly as it has always behaved. Light arrives. Light departs. The stars hold their positions in the sky, slowly shifting over the centuries of the crossing. The probe is, in a small and patient way, a kind of arrival. It is the first piece of the village that has stepped outside the walls of the village. The probe does not know it is doing this. It is not built to know. It is built to do what it was sent to do, and to report what it finds. But somewhere, on the planet it left behind, a long-tenured institution is keeping its records, preserving its codes, maintaining the dishes that will receive its data, training the engineers who will interpret the signals when they arrive. The institution is part of the probe. The probe is part of the institution. Together, they are a small experiment in long-duration coherence, a test of whether the species can be the kind of civilization that sustains such projects across the time required. If the experiment succeeds, more probes will follow. If the experiment fails, the institution will dissolve and the probe will continue on its way, gathering data that no one is left to receive. Either way, the probe will reach its destination, in its own time, on its own trajectory, indifferent to the politics of the planet that built it. The universe is generous about which limits it lets the species approach. It is also patient about how long the species takes to approach them. The cage is larger than it looks. The fences are honest. The garden is open. The species has begun to walk. There is more time than the species realizes. There is more space than the species can ever fill. The question has been asked, and the question has been answered, in the slow voice of a documentary that is in no hurry to arrive at its own conclusion. There is a particular image worth holding at the end. Consider the small probe again, drifting in the long dark between two stars. Around the probe, the universe behaves as it always has. Photons stream past, some from the destination ahead, some from the home star behind, some from the great wash of distant galaxies that fill every direction in which the probe is not looking. The probe is moving, in the frame of the local stars, at a speed that would seem fast to a poet and modest to a relativist. It is moving, in its own frame, more slowly than the local stars are moving past it. The two descriptions are both correct. They are the two descriptions that the geometry of the universe permits, and they sit beside one another without contradiction. The probe will arrive at its destination on a schedule set by the geometry. Nothing the engineers on the home planet can do will speed it up. Nothing they can do will slow it down. The probe is committed to its trajectory. The waiting is done by the institution on the home planet. The traveling is done by the probe. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient alone. Together they describe a single act of arrival, distributed across the centuries that separate the launch from the data. The deeper image, perhaps, is of a species learning to be the kind of institution that can sustain such acts. The engineering of the probe is, in some ways, the easier task. The engineering of the institution is the harder one. The species has built institutions that lasted 1,000 years. It has not yet built institutions that lasted 10,000. The question of whether it can do so is not yet answered. The question may take a long time to answer. The probe, in the meantime, drifts patiently between two stars, indifferent to the politics of its makers, faithful only to the trajectory that was given to it and to the schedule that the universe accepts. And so we let the question rest where it has always rested, inside a body, on a small world, under a sky that is open at every angle except one. The cage is real, but it is larger than the question feared. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow. Let the dark of the room become the dark between the stars. Sleep well, and good night.